Good morning. This is the YouTube channel of The Study, myself Aman Jha, and we are continuing with the NCERT concept series. If you recall, we are studying the class 7th history NCERT. Till now, we have covered up to chapter 7, and today we are going to focus on chapter 8. So, let's start. See, if we go through the contents once again, I would like to emphasize the importance of these two chapters, okay, because they highlight the material and social changes in society, the changes that were going on. First, these were about the political things, right? The political changes in early medieval period, Delhi Sultanate, Mughal Empire, and then the rulers tried to convey certain messages through their buildings, both public and private. And then these two chapters talked about the towns, traders, craft persons. That means the continuing urbanization, which is based on the growth of agriculture, and then the relationship between tribes, nomads, and settled communities. Basically, the relationship is a rather complex one, both of competition and collaboration, but eventually the direction is unmistakable. More or less, always tribes and nomads turn into settled societies. They adopt their practices, they adopt new religions, they adopt new political institutions, especially creation of state. Now, in chapter 8, we are going to focus on the associated religious changes. Earlier we saw material, social changes. Today we are going to focus on religious changes. If you recall, we had talked about that when a tribal society turns into a peasant society, it adopts not only social institutions, not only political institutions, but there are certain changes in their religious practices as well. In some areas, they adopted Islam. In some areas, they adopted Sikhism. In some areas, they adopted the Puranic way of worshipping gods. Okay, they became part of the Orthodox Hindu society and such things. So, and there were many social reforms as well, popular social reforms. So, we will look into those things in this chapter. The name of the chapter is A Devotional Path to the Divine, and basically it goes in this order. Okay, it talks about, the title is The Idea of a Supreme God, but what it basically is, that it is a recap of the main religious developments in the ancient period, okay, that we will see later. Then it begins here, a new kind of bhakti in South India. A new kind means there must have been old kind here, okay. Basically, it is a popular social movement. That is why they are calling us, new kind, a popular social movement. Earlier one, it is believed by many historians that the bhakti known in ancient India, in North India, wasn't a popular one, but this was. We will understand it later. Then, from the bhakti of Nayanar and Alvar saints, we look into the philosophical underpinnings, and using the philosophical doctrines and social movement, then we have manifestation of bhakti in different regions, and see the order. First it talks about Basavan's Veer Shaivism in Karnataka region, then it moves further up towards the Maharashtra in the form of Maharashtra Dharma and some important saints of Maharashtra Dharma. Then it talks about the prevalent popular movements in North India, be it Nath Panthis, Siddh and Yoga. Then it talks about the arrival of Islam and Sufism, and as a cumulative effect of all these things, it talked about a new religious development in North India, which is a combination of above factors. And then we give a close look to Kabir and Guru Nanak. First, the idea of a supreme God. It is essentially a recap of the religious developments in ancient period. It says earlier different societies worship differently. Okay, obviously this statement is added by us. We know about Vedic religion but there were many non-Vedic societies living in the same area or elsewhere in the country. For example, the megalithic society, about which we studied in the ancient history in class 6th. Look, the Vedic Aryan religion of the early Vedic period and later Vedic period, these are known to us via Vedic corpus, right? However, there were many people who lived in the vicinity of Aryan societies that were non-Aryans. Also, there was a vast area of the subcontinent which wasn't inhabited by Aryans, and where the Aryan values did not percolate at that point. So they had different values. For example, if you recall, we had talked about that in early Vedic period, the Sapta Sindhu area, that is Indus and its tributaries, that was the main core of Aryandom. Then in later Vedic period, the Indo-Gangetic Doab and the Upper Ganga Valley, that was the core areas of Aryandom. But what about the rest of the country? The people living in the rest of the country must have some sort of religious values. They must have their own way of worshipping gods. They must have their own metaphysical thinkings. One example is megalithic societies, that they must have had, some of them were in the proto-urban stage, but we don't know about their values, the non-material segment of their culture. So different people had different ways of worship. However, as people were brought together through the growth of towns, trade and empires, up to the end of later Vedic period and beginning of Mahajanpad period, right? New ideas also developed. The ideas of karma and rebirth. Birthrights means if you are born a Kshatriya, then you have right to rule. If you are born a Shudra, then you are supposed to serve the higher three Varnas. Such birth-based privileges and responsibilities, okay? Such things. Varna-based socio-political hierarchies gained ground, okay? The ongoing transformative social changes made many people uneasy. If you recall, then we had talked about that from early Vedic period to later Vedic period, the religion and social outlook had become more rigid, more orthodox and more patriarchal. Similar process had happened up to the Mahajanpad period. But by that time, a lot of material changes had happened and a philosophical, religious and ideological pushback came in the form of heterodox sects and Upanishadic philosophies. Upanishadic philosophies were reformist and heterodox sects were kind of, factions that did not accept the supremacy of Vedas. According to which it was possible to overcome social differences and break the cycle of rebirth through personal effort. For example, in Buddhism, Buddha said that if you follow the Ashtanga mark, the eightfold path, then you can achieve nirvana. But first you become ascetic, follow the Ashtanga mark, then you achieve nirvana, and then you get free from these social hierarchies in this world, and this cycle of birth and karma and rebirth. In Jain, something similar. They also talked about adopting extreme penances. In Upanishadic philosophies, they said that look, sacrifices are important. We are not denying that they earn a certain merit, but however, if you want to achieve salvation, nirvana, then you have to get the true knowledge about the relationship between Atman and Brahman. So these were pushbacks against the prevalent orthodoxy in society. However, the problem is that in Buddhism and Jainism, they said that to achieve nirvana, okay, you have to first renounce the world. You have to become ascetic. While you can be a very good person as a householder, but you cannot achieve nirvana. You cannot achieve moksha. Similarly, in Upanishadic philosophy, they said that you have to, assert yourself. You have to work really hard to gain the true knowledge about the relationship between, or rather, the knowledge of the oneness of the Brahma and Atma. So these things, though there was certain appeal of these ideas, they cannot be popular, okay? Because people would not like to leave their house and become ascetic, okay? And you don't have that much time to focus entirely, leave everything else, every other occupation and possession, and then you go in the search of true knowledge. So there were more movements. Now some of it might be under the influence of foreign elements. For example, the Gandhar school of art developed under the where there was a lot of influence of Greek and Hellenistic school of art. Okay, the idea of it is possible, if you recall, we had talked about it in the classics NCERT, that it is possible that the certain elements or the certain level of inspiration for idol worship came from Gandhara school of architecture, which in turn was inspired by the Hellenistic art. In post-Mauryan period, the idea of bhakti for deliverance, that is a personal devotion or love to the supreme god expressed in different ways, appeared in different sects. This idea, advocated in the Bhagavad Gita, became popular in the early centuries of Common Era. In Bhagavad Gita, there is this message of, a complete devotion and love for Bhagwan Sri Krishna. Okay? They say that you have to karm kar phal ki ichha mat kar, that sort of message, that you have to do your karm, you have to follow with the god you worship with complete dedication. Okay? And what else you do? You worship their idols, you go on pilgrimage, you do fasting, you do kirtan and such sort of stuff. So a personal dedication to the god is the way to achieve, to achieve deliverance. That means now you can call it moksha, you can call it nirvana, whatever you want to call, but this is the way. Bhakti is the way. Not knowledge, okay, not following eightfold path, not sacrifices, but bhakti. A personal dedication, love, surrender to the one supreme God that you worship. Now, you can, to a limited extent, compare it to monotheism. Why? Because here, someone who is bhakt, he is not supposed to worship all the gods. Okay, he is not supposed to invoke different gods in different sacrifices. Okay. Similarly, it is not atheist as at least the earlier Buddhism was. Okay. See, what it says, that you choose one God that you worship as supreme. Okay. You are not supposed to deny or quarrel with the followers of other sects or other gods, but you follow the path, or you follow the one God. So it is, to a limited extent, you can compare it with monotheism. This idea of bhakti became so popular that even Buddhists and Jain adopted this practice. If you recall, in the post-Mauryan period, the idea of idol worship had not only appeared in Hinduism, but in Buddhism and Jainism as well, isn't it? Also, they would worship Bodhisattva, who is compassionate. You have to worship him. Then the idea of pilgrimage, going to the important going on the pilgrimage to stupas and performing rituals there. Similarly, the idol worship became part of Jainism also. There have been Jain temples which are that old. So the idea of bhakti not only appeared in Brahminism or early Hinduism, but in Buddhism and Jainism as well. Shiva, Vishnu, Durga came to be worshipped as supreme deities, and gods and goddesses worshipped in different areas came to be identified with them through Avatarvad. Avatarvad means the theory of incarnation. Okay, how? That is the question, that how different the gods and goddesses worshipped in different parts of the country became associated with Shiva, Vishnu and Durga. How Jagannath was identified with Krishna, who is in turn a avatar of Vishnu. How Ram, who is popular in one part of the country, became avatar of Vishnu. How Murugan, popular in South India, became an avatar of Kartikeya Skand, who is son of Shiv. How there are different avatar of Durga. So how these things happened, how there was this synthesis or the creation of an all India pantheon. It says, in the process, local myths and legends became, we will see, okay, first see this one. Before going to this, because since we have asked the question how, then therefore we should look into the answer first. Expansion of agrarian economy through land grants to the Brahmanas facilitated incorporation of tribal societies into caste-based peasant societies, and appropriation of tribal gods into an all-India pantheon through the Avatarvad of Puranic literature and temple. See, most of these stories of avatar, that how a particular god in a particular circumstances takes a certain avatar to solve a very specific problem, either having to do with a moral or social crisis, or having to do with some villain who is tormenting the people and tormenting the gods. So such stories first appeared in Puranic literature. So through the Avatarvad and temple cult. That means in local area, a god which was only worshipped in a, concept, in a form of concept. Just as, if you recall earlier in Heenan, Buddha was worshipped in a concept form. That if you want to represent the Dharma Chakra Parivartan, the first sermon he gave, you draw a wheel. If you want to symbolize his gaining prabodhan or enlightenment, what you say, then you can, make a tree. If you want to symbolize his death, then you could put an empty throne or stoop. So first he was worshipped in a conceptual form, but then idols were made. Then idols were placed in stoop. Similarly, the local gods and goddess, which may or may not have been worshipped in conceptual form, or maybe just worshipped without, as a prayer to them. Just as they in early Vedic period, they did not build the temples or the statues of Indra or Varun. They were worshipped and they conducted sacrifices in their name, but there was no concept of temple. So similarly, even local gods and goddesses were only worshipped. People prayed to them, people invoked them in certain rituals, people might have conducted some other sort of sacrifices. But then eventually the idea came up that no, they should be worshipped in the form of a statue, in the form of an idol, in the form of an idol that would be put in a temple eventually. So the temple cult and Avatarvad of Puranic literature brought together gods and goddesses from different parts of country into a pan-India pantheon. In the process, local myths and legends became a part of the Puranic stories, and methods of worship recommended in the Puranas were introduced in the local cults. Methods of worship recommended means what? Idol worship, temple, in the form of, then you build temples for them, then you go on pilgrimage, you undertake fast, you undertake kirtan and different sorts of yagya, the things like it's very common even today to conduct some of the yagya, right? Like katha, what we in Hindi we say that they are doing katha or they are doing jagrata, that sort of stuff. So in a way, these practices became part of the local cult. Okay, the Puranas laid down that devotees could receive the grace of God regardless of their caste and gender. Okay, so certain amount of social liberalization, social liberalization. If you recall, the Shudras and women were not permitted to, listen to Vedas and learn the Vedas, but here the Puranas are saying that the devotees could receive the grace of God. That means you can, worship the God and regardless of your caste and gender. But it did not go any further. And the message of this slide is this: it did not go any further. There was a certain degree of, social liberalization, but that was it. It did not turn into a social movement. It did not turn into an anti-establishment social movement. It wasn't popular, means popular among people, not a popular social movement, okay? Not a popular social movement. That is the word you should remember. And one hint of the fact that it wasn't a social movement is the fact that Puranas were written in Sanskrit. Now, if it was a popular movement, then Puranas would be written in native languages. Things like Prakrit or Pali or some, Suraseni or whichever language was prevalent in the region. But they were written in Sanskrit. So that's also another hint that yes, true, there was, loosening of some social restrictions, but it was not a popular movement. Also, the fact that this is the historian Satish Chandra argues that since in North India, very early on, the Rajput plus Brahman alliance had appropriated the temple cult for legitimization of their power. Okay, so this alliance which gave legitimization to both of them, they had appropriated the temple cult. If you recall that by the early medieval period, very lofty and grand temples were being built in North India as well. You have the temple of Khajuraho. For example, if you recall a few chapters back, when we were talking about rulers and buildings, we talked about the Kandaria Mahadev temple. Even there, they had said that commoners were not permitted to enter that temple. So, in North India, the ruling class and priestly class came to an alliance. They gave some social freedom, But largely the temple cult and the North Indian version of Bhakti at that point was not a popular social movement. In fact, the popular social movement of the time was being run by Nath Panthis, Siddhas and yogis that we will see later. Okay, it was rather an orthodox one, because the same ruling class was saying that we are upholding the the Varna based social order. So it says that the temples that were being built at that point, they were a symbol of royal authority. They did not symbolize any popular movement, because the same kings were also saying that we are upholding the Varna based social order. The Puranas were written in Sanskrit. It did not talk much about Puranas did not talk about the removing the caste barrier or removing the gender barrier. It simply said that look, even women and different castes, Shudras, can listen to Puranas and they can do bhakti of their god. That was about it. That was the idea here, that it was not a popular social movement. A popular social movement started in South through the poems of Alvar and Nainar Sens, and from there it came to North in a new bhakti from South. Look, understand the word. It is new. That means there must be an old one. The old bhakti that rose in North India in post-Mauryan period, I am repeating myself here, was not a popular social movement. It did not talk about social emancipation. It did not talk about the gender and caste based disabilities. It did not revolt against the existing status quo, existing establishment, because here the alliance between the priestly class and ruling class ensured that the temple cult represented the legitimization of king. They ensured that the Varna based or Jati or caste based social order was upheld, and they gave only certain limited concessions to the popular, the lower class and the people. But as a social movement, as a revolt, it started in South and from there it went northward. So understand the word new bhakti. The 7th to 9th century saw the emergence of a new movement, of new movements led by the Nayanars and Alvars. Now Nayanars are the devotees of Shiva and his various avatars, and Alvars are devotees of Vishnu and his various avatars. For example, there are certain Alvars that worship Krishna, but then there are certain that worship Ram. Okay, so this is the broad generalization. They came from all castes. See, Puranas were mostly written by Brahmins. They took the tribal stories and fused them with the larger gods in the form of Avatarvad. But here, these saints are coming from all castes, including the considered untouchables, that were considered untouchables like Pulayar and Panars. They were sharply critical of Buddhists and Jains. Now, this is a very interesting point. Even the early poems by Alvar and Nainar Sens criticizes the Buddhists and Jains. And historians believe that this was so because Buddhists and Jains were entrenched power structures in the royal courts at the time. We said in the case of North India, the Brahman and Rajput alliance was the status quo. In the case of South, it is believed that the Jains and Buddhists held control over the royal courts. Therefore, these popular saints were criticizing them. Therefore, they were arguing against the asceticism, the extreme penances, the aloofness of the Buddhist and Jain institutions from people, their remoteness. Because if you see in the post-Gupta period and in early medieval period, most of the Buddhist monasteries are in far-off region. They are, they have lost their touch with people. They control the royal courts, and they get lot of donations from priests and sorry, not from priests, from kings, etc. But they have lost the touch with people. Okay, and that is why they are being criticized by the Alvar and Nainar Sens. And they preached ardent love of Shiva and Vishnu as the path to salvation. They drew upon the ideals of love and heroism as found in the Sangam literature, okay, which was composed in post-Mauryan period. Look, here again I would like to emphasize the epics like Shilpadigaram, Mani Mekhalai, they are not Sangam literature, okay. and blended them with the value of bhakti. What is values of bhakti? What are they? Dedication, surrender to one infallible supreme God. Okay, these saints went from place to place composing poems in the praise of deities enshrined in the villages they visited. Okay, the Pallavas, Cholas, and Pandyas king built elaborate temples. The book only says gives the example of Cholas and Pandyas. I don't know why they omitted Pallavas, but Pallavas also built some grand temples. They built elaborate temples around many of the shrines visited by these saint poets, strengthening the link between bhakti tradition and temple worship. Now here is a contradiction. Just here I said that Buddhists and Jains were entrenched. They were part of the status quo at this point. But now we are saying that these kings were building shrines for these after following the pattern of bhakti saints, because this is where the shift took place. Okay, this is how the shift happened. That once kings saw that these gods and these saints are popular among the people. Therefore, once a new ruling class came, which required a new legitimization theory, a new story, then they decided to appropriate the gods and the saints that were popular among people. So this is where the shift happened. Okay, the popular pressure from below, stimulated the new kings and dynasties to adopt their practices. So here you can say effectively that up to this point, the dominance of Buddhists and Jains in the royal courts ended. In fact, we have up to this point, when the entry of acharyas, like the gurus like Shankaracharya, Ramanujacharya takes place, there you see the examples like Shankaracharya going from court to court, undertaking very rigorous philosophical and theosophical discussions with these, Buddhist monks and Jain monks. These are the stories associated with, linked to his life. We may never know the exact truth, but maybe these stories give us a sense of what was the underlying motive at this here, or the underlying play going on. There are many stories where he goes from courts to courts, undertakes discussions or debates with the priests and monks of Buddhist and Jain faith, defeats them. So what it tells you, that there was a sort of competition going on. Okay, competition for royal patronage, competition for getting hold of power. So when the new dynasties came up, they saw that the gods like Shiva, Vishnu and their avatar are popular among the people. These Alvar and Nainar saints are composing very emotional and moving poems about them, and they are very popular among people. So they started from Buddhist and Jain leadership to priestly leadership to Brahminic leadership, they moved. Maybe you can compare it with appropriation of, popular belief. They saw that since Buddhists and Jains are not that popular now, so they appropriated what was popular. See, even in temples, they have these statues of these Tamil saints. Here you have very famous Nainar saints, Appar Sambandar, Sundar, and you have their statues here. Appar Sambandar, Sundarar and Manikava Chakar. Now some places they call Chakar, some places they say Sagar. Okay. Here all four are there, and here only Manikava Chakar, his idol, is there. They used to put these in temples. So not only the gods they worshipped, even the main saints became very popular. This was also the time when their poems were compiled. Hagiographies of Alvars and Nainars were composed. Hagiographies means biography of saintly figures. Okay. We use these texts as source for writing history of Bhakti tradition. Look, these texts are themselves not history. They are a source to write history. Okay. What I just said, that when we listen to the story of Shankaracharya going from one royal court to another, defeating Buddhists and Jain monks in philosophical discussions, then it is irrelevant that whether these discussions took place or not. What we should understand, that there was a competition going on between the priestly class of one faith and the priestly class of another, because everybody seeks access to royal power. This is how you can entrench your authority. This is how you can expand and propagate your religion. This is just the way the competition between different sects and different religions goes. This was in the book. This is on the internet, you can see it. There were 63 Nayanars, means the devotees of Shiv who belong to different caste backgrounds such as potters, untouchable workers, peasants, hunters, soldiers, brahmanas and chiefs. So there were some brahmanas, it's not that they were completely excluded. The best known among them were Appar, Sambandar, Sundarar and Manikava Sagar. Now somewhere they will write Sagar, somewhere they will write like Chakar. Okay. There are two sets of compilations of their song, Tevaram and Tiruvachakam. Tevaram was written by these three. Okay, Appar, Sambandar and Sundarar, and Tiruvachakam was written by Manikava Chakar. Okay, Tiruvakam. And then there are 12 Alvar saints. 12 means not only 12, this is an illustrative list, means these are the famous ones. Similarly in the case of Nayanars, who came from equally divergent backgrounds, the best known being Periyalvar, his daughter Andal, Tundardipodi, Alvar and Nammallar. Their songs were compiled in the Divya Prabandham. The whole name is Nalayira Divya Prabandham. Now you could frame some prelims related questions based from this information. Now it will be very easy to ask that what is the difference between Nayanar and Alvar saints. But since they have once in 2012 or 13 had asked the difference between Chaitya and Vihara, then certainly if you can ask that easy question, then you can ask this also, that what is the difference between Nayanar and Alvar. And trust me, in the heat of the moment, people often get confused as well. Then Sambandar, Sundar, Appar and Manikava Chakar, they may create a question that they were Alvar or Nayanar. So they were certainly Nayanar. Okay. Now we talked about Tevaram, Tirukkovachakam and Tirumurai. These, see, Tirumurai is the largest compilation. It has 12 volumes in it. Tevaram is there, Tiruvachakam is there, and Periya Puranam. This is the hagiography of important Nayanar. This example is not given in the book, okay? So you can look for it on internet, but you cannot find it in the book. This is the hagiography of, okay? That means the biography of important Nayanar saints. It was written by a Chola minister, okay? Shekikar, his name was Shekikar. He wrote it in early medieval period. So this is the 12th volume of Tirumurai. Tevaram is inside Tirumurai, and so is this and this one. And then we said that they could create a question on, they could give the name of these Alvar saints and they can ask that they are Alvar or Nayanar. And Nalayira Divya Prabandham, the one, this one, their songs were compiled in this one. Okay. Since they have put this in 7th class NCERT, so you can expect that they can ask a question on the basis as well. Now here you see the Bhakti movement starts here, okay, and up to the Pallava, Chera and Pandya phase, it becomes very robust, and from here it starts moving upward. Okay, Ramanuja, the entry of Acharya, okay, and they have given the important Alvar saint, important Nayanar saint. See, an important Alvar saint, Nammallavar, 9th century, Manikava Sagar, 9th century, and then the entry of Acharya. It is believed that once Acharyas, they entered the Bhakti movement, the popular social movement of South India, then it started competing for the patronage with Buddhists and Jains, and there you have this complete system now where you have a popular mode of worship as well as you have, you know, a philosophical underpinning. But the negative aspect was that the social radicalness, since the entry of acharyas that were mostly the Brahmin high priests, the element of social radicalness was reduced considerably. Okay. The plus point was that now a popular mode of worship had philosophical underpinning as well. So now you have a complete system. But the drawback was that the message of social reform, the social radicalism, it was severely diluted. Okay. From here you see the movement upward. In 12th century, the Veer Shaivism of Basavan started. Then you have Maharashtra Dharma in 14th, 16th century. And then you come here in 15th 16th century North India. Here the bhakti movement in combination with the Sufi movement that came from outside, and the already prevalent, the Nath Panthi popular, the Nath Panthi Siddha Yoga popular social movement. They were also talking about social reforms and social radicalism. Okay, talking about the simplifying the religion, criticizing the superstitions and such thing. When a movement is popular social movement, when it talks about the interest of common people, okay, when it tries to when it criticizes the institutions that perpetuates their exploitation. In the case of India, you can say that when a movement is criticizing the caste discrimination, when it is talking about the upliftment and empowerment of women, when it is criticizing the superstitions or the the unnecessary, or rather the unfair, the accumulation of power in the hand of kings and priests, then those are the features of popular movement. Okay, so Sadhan Bhakti combined with the Sufi and the already popular social movement of North India, Nath Panthis, etc. There you have a Bhakti of North India as well. Philosophy of Bhakti or philosophy and Bhakti, whichever word you want to use, because they gave a philosophical underpinning to Bhakti. Shankaracharya, he was, now most of the things we know about Shankaracharya are almost legendary, so it is very difficult to separate fact from fiction. But he was a 8th century figure born in Kerala. Now the story you already know about him. He went around the country, he traversed the length and breadth of the country, established 4 mathas, right? Shankaracharya's Advaitvad, that means the doctrine of oneness of Atma and Brahma. He taught that Brahma was without any attributes. Without any attributes, meaning Brahma is shapeless, formless, and has no other attributes. That means that good and bad, evil and pure, the things as we humans understand, the Supreme Being is not bothered about it. Okay? He considered the world as Maya, that means illusion, and preached renunciation in order to follow the path of knowledge so as to understand the true nature of Brahma, Atma, and their essential oneness in order to attain salvation. So it is also, very much Upanishadic in thinking, that you are focusing on knowledge, that gain the knowledge of the oneness. His theory was essentially based on the Badrayana's Brahma Sutra, which is a commentary on Upanishads. See, since there were hundreds of Upanishads, and at least a dozen of them are very important, and Upanishads talk about a lot of ideas. Okay, the things like karma, rebirth, salvation, the knowledge, the relationship between Atma and Brahma. So if there are so many different texts exploring a certain set of ideas, then definitely there will be variations in the way they give explanation, in the way they give their conclusion. So in post-Mauryan period, this Badrayana wrote Brahma Sutra, which was a commentary on Upanishads, commentary on the popular themes and the most popular conclusions and their own inputs. So based on Brahma Sutra, which was written in post-Mauryan period, Shankaracharya developed his own Advaitvad in early medieval period. Here, since Bhakti talks about a supreme being that is omnipotent, all-powerful, and the Brahma, the ultimate reality in Shankaracharya's Advaitvad, is also all-powerful. So there was some, similarity between those ideas. But the one problem was that the Brahma is without attributes. That means when you have an idol has attributes. It has a shape, it has a form. Okay, it blesses you in certain circumstances. You can earn its grace. So there was, a certain degree of separation between the Advaitavad of Shankaracharya and the popular Bhakti movement. So a small concession he gave, that yes, in day-to-day life, different people practicing different occupations and having different expectations, they need to worship certain imperfect and partial gods that you can please and you can earn their grace. However, the real conjunction or the real full alignment between Bhaktism and the philosophy was brought by Ramanujacharya. He was an Alvar, means follower of Vishnu. According to him, the best way to achieve salvation was through an intense devotion to Shiva. You need devotion, not knowledge. Knowledge is okay, fine, but knowledge alone will not get you salvation. Therefore, Shankaracharya's way was called Gyan Marg, and this is called Bhakti Marg. That means the way of devotion and the way of knowledge. So as to attain bliss of union with him, he propounded the doctrine of Vishisht Advaitavad. That means qualified monism. Ramanuj, he says that even when soul is united, qualified monism, that is the soul even when united with the Supreme God remains distinct. Shankaracharya says that there is no difference between the Atma and Brahma, and once you realize the true oneness, they become part of it. They become same. But Ramanuj says that no, even when the soul is united with the Supreme God, it remains distinct. For example, the whiteness of milk, it is different. It is united with the milk, still it is, is different. Just as when snake creates a coil. Now, coil is something, but it cannot exist without snake, isn't it? The redness of a red rose, it cannot exist without the rose. So, by using some, such analogies, they try to prove their point that individual Atma and Brahma, they are related to each other, yet they are a bit separate, and even when they are united, it still retains its identity. The point is, you should achieve a union. You should achieve nearness to the God. You don't have to annihilate the self and become fully part of the Brahma. Now, here it might appear a lot of, it's a very lofty idea. It might appear to some of you that you might think, okay, what is it? Do I have to explore it further? Okay. Do I have to read certain granth? Always remember, you are studying history for competitive examinations. Studying for competitive examinations had a utilitarian, not only it has a utilitarian aspect to it. That means understand the concept only till the point that you need to clear your exam. Okay. Understand the broad differences between the Dvaitvad and Advaitvad. Understand its link to Bhaktism, and that is about it. You need not bother about the internal coherency of a philosophical idea. That is for the true acharyas to worry about. Okay. There are some other saints as well. For example, Madhavacharya, he gave a Dvaitvad, where he says, no, there is no such thing as, partial, or you can say qualified monism. There is a complete dualism. He says that Brahma and Atma are totally separate, okay, things. They are not, same yet distinct. That there is no such thing. He says they are completely separate. Then there was Nimbarak, Ramanand, who preached in Hindi. He is credited for possibly bringing Bhakti movement, the popular Bhakti movement to North India. There was Vallabhacharya, and these were some of the other important acharyas. And then we move slightly upward. We look into the Basavan's Veershaivism. Who was Basavan? He was a 12th century Brahmin minister of Kalyani Chalukya. This was in North Karnataka. The word Kalyani is key. If you recall, there were earlier Chalukya dynasty of Pulakeshin that defeated the Harshavardhan. They were from Badami. Their capital was Badami. So they are called Badami Chalukyas. Eventually, in early medieval period, another branch of Chalukyas emerged from Kalyani. So he was a minister. We have noted the connections between the Tamil Bhakti movement and temple worship. That eventually a temple worship became part of the Tamil Bhakti movement. This in turn led to a reaction that is best represented in the Veershaiva movement initiated by Basavan and his companions like Alama Prabhu and Akka Mahadevi. Okay, she is a very important saint of medieval period. This movement began in Karnataka in mid-12th century. It was a Shaivite movement. The Veershaivas argued strongly for equality of all human beings and against Brahminical ideas about caste and the treatment of women. They were also against all forms of ritual and idol worship. We said that it was a reaction against temple. So therefore, they said, no, we don't want to worship temple, but we want to worship Shiv. Now see, In a way, for them, Shiva is Brahma. He is the ultimate reality. He is the omnipotent God. He is the shapeless, formless, attributeless. They call it Shiv, and they worship it not in the form of ideals. They did not like not in the form of idols. They did not like the temple worship. Okay. There are some additional points. For example, some reforms by Basavan, who says, and their ideas of to go back a bit, their ideas about the status of women and the caste hierarchies were really radical for their time. Okay. Some of the reforms initiated by Basavan, like Anubhav Mandap, here it was a public institution where people from different backgrounds came together and shared their, philosophical and religious experiences. They composed their own vachan and they recited them there, and from there they were taken to the other parts of the country. Vachans were, the compositions by Veer Shaiva saints, including Basavana, are called vachans. They could easily create a prelims question from it. Later we will see about the Abhang. The Abhangas were created by Maharashtra Dharm saints. The Lingayat movement, which was very popular some years back, if you recall that they were arguing that they should be treated as separate from Hinduism, it emerged from the Veer Shaivism. Basically what they do, they wear the Shivling as a locket. Therefore they are called Lingayats. Okay. And Basava Kalyan is a town, is a modern town in modern Karnataka. You can look up on the internet or in your map. This is named after Basavan. Okay. See one vachan attributed to Basavan. The rich will make temples for Shiva. What shall I, a poor man, do? My legs are pillars, the body the shrine, the head of a cupola of gold. Now this is a very interesting part. Listen, O Lord, of the meeting of rivers. Things standing shall fall, but the moving ever shall stay. He says the temples will fall eventually. But the moving, that is the human heart where, where we worship you, where we keep you. Okay, that will ever stay standing. So this is a kind of revolt against the temple cult and the dominance of the priestly class, the acharyas in the bhakti movement, which they were acquiring slowly. Then we go slightly up, Maharashtra Dharma. From 13th to 14th century, Maharashtra saw a number of saint poets whose songs in Marathi continue to inspire people. Look, they were writing in Marathi, a regional language. Okay, remember, once the regional language flourishes, cultural renaissance takes place, and a cultural renaissance will invariably lead to political resurgence. We will see later. Gyaneshwar, Namadev, Eknath and Tukaram, as well as women like Sakubai and Chokhamela, who belong to the untouchable Mahar caste, they were the important Maharashtra Dharma saints. Okay, they used what? Their compositions are called Abhang. That means unbreakable. This tradition of bhakti focused on the Vitthal temple of Pandharpur. It's called Varkari sect, as well as a personal god residing in the hearts of people. Okay, these, in the Varkari sect, there is a lot of focus on doing a pilgrimage to Pandharpur. So you have a lot of festivals at Pandharpur, and if you go to Maharashtra, you will see small bands of people traveling on foot going to Pandharpur or some other shrines. These saints poets rejected all form of ritualism. See, this popular social movement. Outward display of piety and social differences based on birth. They even rejected the idea of renunciation. That means they said, no, we will not renounce our family, we will not renounce this world, and often live with their families. This is very radical. Why? While earning their livelihoods like any other person and humbly serving other people. Now, they have not mentioned this another sect called Dharkari sect. We mentioned one Varkari sect here. It was initiated by Ramdas Samarth, and he was the guru of Shivaji. What he said, he not only talked about social issues and religious issues, he also talked about political issues. That social movement, religious movement cannot be isolated. It has to incorporate political, freedom and political stuff as well. So from here you can see the rise of, the rise of political ambition and the rise of a separate Maratha empire. It is linked to creation of a coherent regional identity. Once you have once local language has developed, once it has its own religious sentiments, okay, once it has its own social values and norms, then eventually these ideas will help to shape a regional identity, and that identity will help in political resurgence. A new humanist idea emphasized that bhakti lay in sharing others' pains emerged, as the famous Gujarati saint Narsingh Mehta said that they are Vaishnavas who feel the pain of other. You know that popular or rather favorite song of Gandhiji, that Vaishnav jan to tene kahiye peer parai jane re. That this is what they are talking about. A humanistic approach. That means putting human beings at the center of your bhakti. Okay, that look, focus on human beings. If you serve them, if you look after their welfare, that is equal to worshipping your God. So this was a humanistic aspect as well. Here we have given two Abhang by Sant Tukaram and Chokha Mela's son. Chokha Mela's basically entire family became part of this movement. He who identified with the battered and the beaten, mark him as a saint. A humanism, putting humans at the center of bhakti. He says that yes, when we say humanism, what we mean? We means that yes, you worship a supreme God, but you do not show a callous attitude towards the plights of your fellow human beings. They said yes, we want to worship the ultimate reality, the God, but it has to be via social work. For God is with him who holds every forsaken man close to his heart. He treats a slave as his own, says Tuka. I won't be tired to repeat again, such a man is God in person. Similarly, Chokha Mela's son says, you made us low caste. Why don't you face that fact, great Lord? Our whole life left over food to eat. You should be ashamed of this. You have eaten in our home. Can you deny it? Chokha's son Karma Melas asks, why did you give me this? So a radical social message of social reform. Popular social movement, okay, with its own humanistic touch. And then we're talking about the already prevalent popular social movement in North India. Okay, the first is Nathpanthi, Siddhas and Yogis. Now their origin is shrouded in mystery. Okay, we know very little about them because the nature of these movements was that they did not keep they didn't keep lot of written traditions. A number of religious groups that emerged during this period criticized now in the book they are saying that emerged during this period. What they should have said, that were popular during this period. Why? Because they influenced, their message was radical and popular. Okay, they were social reforms movement. B, once the messages of Sufi movement and the Southern Bhakti movement was added to it, something new came up in the form of a Northern Bhakti movement. So they were already popular. Okay, the Siddha and Yogis, they were going around from their monasteries and mathas across the country, spreading their message. Okay. During this period, criticized the ritual and other aspects of conventional religion and social order using simple logical arguments. Among them were the Nathpanthi, Siddhacharas and Yogis. They advocated renunciation of the world. Okay, to them the path to salvation lay in mediation on the formless ultimate reality and the realization of oneness with it. To achieve this, they advocated intense training of mind and body through practices like yogasana, breathing exercises and meditation. These groups became particularly popular. See, this is the point I was saying. It was popular among low castes. Their criticism of conventional religion, that means the Brahminical dominance and extravagant rituals, etc., created the ground for devotional religion to become a popular force in northern India. This is the key. Here they have said, they have indirectly admitted that this is the bedrock of the Bhakti movement that will emerge in coming centuries. The Amrit Kund is the Sanskrit book on Hatha Yoga. It is believed that this book played a key role. Even Hatha Yoga is popular even today. Okay. though it is not widely practiced, and the practitioners of Hatha Yoga tend to keep it among the community, within the community, but it is still popular. And Yoga Sutra of Patanjali. Okay, there are some of the texts that have survived. However, there is not much written about these sects that talks about the organization, the rules of monastic order, rather rules of monastic order. Okay, it does not talk about the popular figures. So we really do not know that when these sects started, who were their popular figures. We do know some names like Gorakhnath, but apart from that, the historical knowledge about the origin and the practices, the monastic order and stuff like that, they are very rare. Okay, but we do know that around this point in early medieval period, they were a popular force in North India. Okay, at the higher level, the alliance between ruling class and priestly class was already there, and they were in control of temple cult. If you recall, the Gupta rulers, they used to call themselves Param Bhagavat. The seal of Gupta rulers was a Garud seal. Now Garud is the Vahan of Vishnu. So the already the Bhakti movement that was already there in North India, it was in alliance with the ruling with the ruling class. So that religion was not popular. At the popular level, at the level of common folks, these ideas were famous. Another change happened in the form of arrival of Sufism. Islam propagated strict monotheism. In the 8th 9th century, scholars developed different aspects and schools of Sharia. Now, if you know, first you have Quran, this is the most foundational book, and then you have Hadith. Okay, these are the revelations by God to Prophet Muhammad himself. These were compiled, and then you have the teachings and sayings and the events from the lives of Prophet Muhammad. They are in the Hadith. On the basis of these two, or the ideas that are not clearly expressed in these two, came up different schools of Sharia. There are total 4 schools, and the most famous in the India is Hanafi. Okay. As Islam gradually became more and more complex, that means its political extent expanded, different ethnic and religious or racial groups became part of the, not religious, but different ethnic or linguistic groups part of it, became part of it. Similarly, they brought their own institutions of society, their own institutions of governance practices. So it became very complex at this point. So as Islam gradually became more complex, Sufis provided another view that favored a more personal devotion to God. And this is where a personal devotion, that Sufism appears very close to Bhaktism, because they also talk about a personal devotion. Look, in Sufism, they say personal devotion to Allah. In Bhaktism and in various strands of Bhaktism, say Nirguna Bhakti or Sagun Bhakti. Now, Nirgun Bhakti also talks about a shapeless, formless God. But in Sagun Bhakti, either you are Krishna Bhakti, either you are in Krishna Bhakti or Ram Bhakti. You accept Krishna as the supreme being. You accept Ram as the supreme being. Now, that is not saying they become intolerant towards other sect, but here, to a limited extent, they are also monotheistic. Okay, that in their day-to-day practices, they are worshipping only one God and calling it Krishna or Ram. Okay, Sufis were mystics. They rejected outward religiosity and emphasized love and devotion to God. So again, they were also a popular social movement. Okay, not worried about the tribulations of trials and tribulations of ruling class, but worried about the welfare of common people and compassion towards fellow human beings. So humanistic as well. Bhakti saints and Sufis had much in common, and possibly they adopted many ideas from each other. For example, this Amrit Kund. Now, R.S. Sharma Satish Chandra points out that Amrit Kund was translated in Arabic, and from Arabic it was translated in Persian. So, some of the ideas of Hatha Yoga, that were the Hatha Yoga was practiced by some Sufi saints as well. So, it is possible that the knowledge of yogic practices and meditation went via this route to Sufi saints. Also, the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, Al-Biruni translated it in Arabic, and even he noticed that some of the yogic practices have similarity with Sufi traditions. And then you have this Mansur bin Halaj. He was an individual, very popular Sufi saint. He came to Sindh area and possibly he interacted with Upanishadic thinkers here. So these these examples are not given in the book, okay? Since they have made what they have done in the book, that they have simply made this point that the Bhakti saints and Sufis had much in common, so possibly they adopted many ideas from each other, but they have not substantiated this argument with any example. So what we have done, we have given few examples from optional level books. If you take optional subject, then there in Satish Chandra or such books you will see these examples. Sufis often rejected the elaborate rituals and codes of behavior demanded by Muslim ulema. So, they were a kind of anti-establishment. They sought union with God much as lover seeks his beloved with a disregard for the world. Among the great saints of Central Asia, Al-Ghazali, Rumi and Sadi were there. Here you have a work of Jalaluddin Rumi. He was a great 13th century Sufi poet from Persia. What he says, he was not on the cross of the Christians. I went to the Hindu temples. In none of them was there any sign. He was not on the heights or in the lowlands. I went to the Kaaba of Makkah. He wasn't there. So he is criticizing everybody, left, right, center. He says, look, you guys are saying that God is here and there. No, I did not see him anywhere. He says, I asked about him from Avicenna the philosopher. He was beyond the range of Avicenna. What he says, that even rational discussions, even using rational discussions, you cannot fathom God. He says, God was beyond the range of Avicenna. I looked into my heart. In that his place I saw him. He was in no other place. That means he says, God is inside my heart only. Okay. See, these things are, for example, here we say that they sought union with God much as lover seeks his beloved with a disregard for the world. If you recall, some time back, there was this movie, Bhag Milkha Bhag. In that they have this song. I can't recall the whole song, but there was this stanza where he says that मैं मंदिर क्यों जावा मेरा यार खुदा है, मैं मस्जिद क्यों जावा मेरा यार खुदा है. So that song is the example of this, practice. Similarly, in the works of Amir Khusro and several medieval Sufis, you see that they tend to portray themselves as I would say as a follower of God, but as a lover of the God. And then according to that they will compose their poems. They have this very famous song that मैं तो पिया से नैना मिला आई रे. And here what they are showing, that they are portraying themselves as the female. Okay, and then they portray God as the male, and then they will write romantic songs. So a song can be at the same time spiritual as well as a romantic song. Then therefore you will see the reason behind the popularity of such Urdu Sufi songs in Hindi cinema is this only, that a spiritual song can at the same time act as a romantic song. Okay. Like the Nath Panthis, Siddha and Yogis, the Sufis too believed that the heart can be trained to look at the world in a different way. They developed elaborate methods using zikr, chanting of a name, contemplation, sama, raqs, discussion of parables, breath control. See what we said, this yogic practices, controlled breathing, under the guidance of a master or peer. Even this, this institution of peer and murid, the master and the disciple, even this comes, if I don't use the word comes, it is very similar to the practice of Guru Shishya in Bhakti, that you have a Guru that teaches you and you serve under him lifelong, and then you branch out yourself. Similarly, the idea of silsila. Thus emerged the silsila, a spiritual genealogy of Sufi teachers, each following a slightly different method of instruction and ritual practice. Like these saint poets, the Sufis too composed poems, expressed feelings, and like the saint poets, the Sufis too composed poems expressing their feelings. Just as Alwar and Nainar saints were, composing poems, and their poems are contained in Nalayirat Devya Prabandhan or Tevaram Tirumurai. Similarly, even they compose stuff and a rich literature in prose, including anecdotes and fables developed around them. Often, this is a very important point, often they, not in the book, but this is what we have added here. These act as more objective sources than the Tawarikh to study history. If you recall, we had talked about that the Tawarikh or Tariq writers, they were essentially court historians. They never went out of the city, mostly lived in royal court, wrote for the sultans so that sultan should reward them. They had a very, strong class bias, strong gender bias, strong religious bias. So often they will portray a secular policy in religious colors. So sometimes they present a very grotesque picture of what was actually happening. But on the other hand, the literature produced by Sufi saints and their disciples, they expresses, an alternative view, and often the view of popular perception. I've given some examples. For example, Malfuzat, the preaching and utterances of these saints. Maktubat means the compilation of their letters. Tazkiras, biographical accounts, and the treatises on Sufi thoughts. So these often act as, alternative sources to study history. Then what happens, for example, if a Sufi saint has given certain preaching, they used to preach throughout their life. So either their disciple was writing it down immediately or on the basis of their memory. Now they would write letters to their own disciples, to different saints, and sometimes to sultans. So some of their disciple would do, they will compile all these letters. So based on these letters, you can construct an alternative version of what was happening. Or you can use them as a supplementary to the Tariq writing. See, Amir Khusro, he was himself a very famous Sufi and disciple of, Chishti order. He has written Masnavi, and often and he was called, if you recall, Tutiye-Hind, the parrot of India. His contribution in art and culture is very significant. He created new rags, he created new musical instruments, okay. He created new styles of writing, composing poetry. Masnavi was not his own invention. This method of writing poems is older than him, but he composed, created new methods of writing poetry also. So even his works sometimes act as history source. A large number of Sufis from Central Asia settled in Hindustan from 11th century onwards. This process was strengthened with the establishment of Delhi Sultanate, when several major Sufi centers developed all over the subcontinent. Another thing was, if you recall, we talked about the Mongol invasion. Mongol invasions of West and Central Asia was also a stimulus for them to migrate to India. And then when the Tamerlane invaded North India, then there was another major push from North India to Central India, South India and East. There were mainly two sorts of Sufi silsilas. One was Ba-Shara, means that follows Sharia, and another was Be-Shara, that did not follow Sharia, and mostly the wandering monks of the orders like Kalandar, Madari, they were Be-Shara. That means they did not follow the norms of Sharia. The Chishti Silsila was among the most influential order. It had a long line of teachers like Khwaja Muinuddin, Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar, Baba Farid, Khwaja Nizamuddin, and Banda Nawaz Gesu Daraz of Gulbarga. He had left Delhi during the 14th century and went to Deccan. Okay, there were some other sects also: Suravardi sect, Naqshbandi sect, the Qadar. And such other, Suravardi and Zakaria, Roshaniya, Naqshbandi, Qadri. For example, Dara Shikoh, he was a follower of Qadri sect. Aurangzeb was the follower of Naqshbandi sect. So there were many other sects, but Chishti Silsila became very popular because almost all of its figures have, shrines in India only. See, even the earliest one, the most popular one, has shrine in India. So that is why it is most important. All of their important saints have shrines in India. Also, Sufi masters held their assemblies in Khanqa or hospices, where devotees of all descriptions, from royal families or commoners, traders, peasants, everybody flocked to these Khanqas. They discussed spiritual matters, sought the blessing of saints, or simply attended music and dance sessions. And here, if the Sufi is giving some preaching, then those preachings and utterances will be recorded in Malfuzat. Often people attributed Sufi masters with miraculous powers that could relieve others of illness and troubles. The tombs or dargah of Sufi saints became a place of pilgrimage. If you recall the Urs festivals, that means the day they die, that becomes a a major pilgrim occasion to which thousands of people of all faiths throng. If you recall, when we were talking about the Delhi Sultans, we said that often Delhi Sultans used to construct, or not only Delhi Sultans, the Sultans of other states also, they used to construct their tombs next to the Sufis, because these Sufis were considered to have so much miraculous powers that not only on earth, they can help them after life, in afterlife as well. They can mediate on their behalf with gods. Okay, so they will believe that if I have my tomb next to the Sufi saint, then he will mediate on my behalf with Allah and help me secure heaven. Similarly, if you could recall, we had talked about the story of Zafar Khan, who established the Bahmani Sultanate. There was a story that once he was going to visit the Nizamuddin Aulia, okay, and what happened here, that Muhammad bin Tughlaq was leaving and he was just arriving. So the Chishti saint says that, look, one sultan is leaving and another is coming. So they said that this was a an ominous saying by Chishti, or rather a forecast by Chishti, that Zafar Khan will eventually go on to create Bahmani Sultanate. So these things show that the importance of Sufis in society. Again, that chart, what we saw, that in around 8th-9th centuries, the popular Alvar Nainar saints, then entry of Acharyas, what they did two things. A, they considerably toned down the social message, but they created a coherent philosophical base for the popular practices. And then we went via Veer Shaivism, Maharashtra Dharma, and we are coming here now. New religious developments in North India. Look, the key word is new. It was inspired by many other things. What were they? New religious developments in North India. The period after 13th century saw a new wave of bhakti. New. This was an age when Islam, Brahminical Hinduism, Sufism, various strands of bhakti and other Nathpanthi, Siddhas and Yogis influenced each other. Due to the combined effect of all these, a new bhakti emerged in North India. The bhakti that was already there since post-Mauryan age was not a social movement. Okay, this is the idea. The social movement, the radical social movement with a radical social message, okay, came from south. New peasantry and new craft persons were emerging from tribals. In last chapter we had seen this point. We saw that new towns and kingdoms were emerging and peasants were taking up new professions and finding new roles for themselves. Just as, if you recall in the first slide, here what we had said, that through the growth of towns, trade and empires, new ideas developed. Okay. Similarly, here also, we are saying that new towns and kingdoms were emerging, people were taking up new professions. Such people, especially craft persons, peasants, traders and laborers, thronged to these saints to listen to their and spread their ideas. Especially important are the groups like peasants, because we have given the examples of Jat peasantry and the tribals of northwest, and then we had given the examples of Ahoms and Gonds as well. Social inequality must have whetted spiritual appetite. If you recall, then we had said that the process of social inequality that had continued during the Delhi Sultans and Mughals, okay, it had not abated. The gap between rich and poor was already increasing, right? Social inequality was also increasing. So this inequality must have whetted the spiritual appetite, meaning just as the rapid social transformation, the glorification of material wealth, the inequality in society created motivation for the rise of heterodox sects. Similarly, something would have happened here. Also, when a tribal society turns into a peasant society, they undergo state formation, their religious practices also change. So, social inequality must have whetted spiritual appetite, meaning that they cannot accept this fact that these inequalities are there and they are ordained by God and such. They want something, they want a message, something that inspires, that improves their lot, that improves their economic and political lot. Some of them, like Kabir and Baba Guru Nanak, rejected all orthodox religions. Others, like Tulsidas and Surdas, accepted existing beliefs and practices but wanted to make this accessible to all. Look, it either you talk about the Protestant reform movement, in which there was one sect called Protestantism that wanted a clear rupture from the Catholic Church. But then there were reformists, the Jesuits within the Catholic Church, that they wanted to reform but stay inside, reform from inside, purge the religion from harmful or pernicious aspects, but stay within the fold. Similarly, in the Mahajanpat period, we saw heterodox sects like Buddhism and Jainism wanting a clean rupture. But on the other hand, you had Upanishadic thinking that continued with the Brahminical tradition, only tried to, reinvent the message behind the sacrifice. They wanted to understand that, look, yes, sacrifices are okay. They earn you merit. However, if you want mukti, if you want moksha, if you want salvation, then you have to understand the relationship between Atma and Brahma. Knowledge is necessary. Sacrifice is not enough. So similarly here also, some wanted to reject all orthodoxy, whereas others, they wanted to purge only the harmful aspects. Tulsidas, and then they have given some examples, like Tulsidas conceived of God as Ram. His Ramcharitmanas, written in Avdi, is important both as an expression of his devotion as well as a literary work. Surdas was an ardent devotee of Krishna. So, see, though they should have given this aspect, but in Bhakti, you have two segments. A, you have Nirgun Bhakti, and then you have the Sagun Bhakti. Here, the God is shapeless, formless, okay? They don't believe in idol worship, they don't believe in temple cut, they worship the God in a shapeless form. The examples are, some of the saints are Kabir and Nanak, Guru Nanak. But here, God is worshipped in a form. Now it could be either Krishna, it could be Ram, it could be Vishnu, it could be Shankar, anything, okay? So God is worshipped in a form. However, apart from these, the social messages are very much same, though the radicalness of their social message might differ slightly. Okay, then Surdas. So Tulsidas and Surdas were Sagun Bhakti saints. His compositions are compiled in Sursagar, Sur Saravali and Sahitya Lahari. Shankar Dev of Assam emphasized, if you recall, we talked about Shankar Dev when we were talking about the Ahom kingdom. We gave a detailed account that first there was this religious rejuvenation followed by the creation of state. Shankar Dev of Assam emphasized the devotion to Vishnu and composed poems and plays in Assamese. He began the practice of setting up Namghar and Satra, that were this is a house of recitation and prayer, and Satras were monasteries, a practice that continues till today. This tradition also included saints like Dadu Dayal, Ravidas and Mirabai. Okay, now Ravidas is even today famous among the North India. Among his followers are called Ravidasiyas. Okay, Mirabai was a Rajput princess married in the royal family of Mewar. She became a disciple of Ravidas, a saint from a caste considered untouchable. She was devoted to Krishna and composed many bhajans, expressing intense devotion. Her songs also openly challenged the norms of upper caste and became popular with the masses. See, now in a way she is a Saguna Bhakti saint, but she also challenges the patriarchal and caste based norms, okay, and therefore popular among the masses of Rajasthan and Gujarat. Now look, whenever we are studying these saints, okay, there are a lot of myths about them. The myth about Mirabai, the myths about Tulsidas, okay, the myths about Kabir, especially about their births and different exploits and his and how they died. For example, there is this famous poem, bhajan, in which Meera says that I have drunk a chalice full of poison. Now you need not take it literally, because we are studying history, we are not studying religion. A rational person will definitely question that how can someone survive while after drinking poison. It could be an allegorical point, it could be an anecdotal point. Disregard it. Similarly, there are legends about how Mirabai died, how Kabir died. For Kabir, they say that when he died, his followers, his Hindu and Muslim followers, had a quarrel that whether they should bury him or whether they should burn him on a funeral pyre. But when they removed his shroud, they saw that there were only some flowers. So we need not take them literally. I have seen some answers where students have, if you ask them a question about the significance of Mirabai to the Bhakti movement, they will write in answer that she was such an intense follower of Krishna that she eventually merged into his statue. Now, these are religious ideas. I do not want to hurt someone's religious feelings by the questioning the authenticity of that account, but those are not historical ideas. When you are writing answers in history, okay, be rational, understand the argument, but you don't need to take everything at the face value. Here you have a poem by a bhajan by Meera. Ranaji, I have left your norms of shame and false decorum of princely life. I have left your town, and yet here she says, Rana, you gave me a cup of poison and I drank it laughingly. Now, these are just, a figure, it's a figure of speech, okay? Saying that you gave me a cup of poison. It could easily mean that, so if someone says that his or her paramour has eyes as deep as an ocean, that is not true, right? That is just a expression. That's just a way of saying. So do not write these things in answer that this saint drank a poison, a cup full of poison, okay, or that saint when died his body turned into flower. You have to take history out of religion. You have to take history out of other sorts of books and then write your answer. This is a very important part. A unique feature of most of the saints is that their works were composed in regional languages. Okay? Therefore, they were popular. That because they were understood by the people. Now, if your message is very radical, but people cannot understand you, then what's the point? They were in regional languages and could be sung. They became immensely popular and were handed down orally from generation to generation. Now there are some problems with being orally handed down. We will see later. Usually poor, deprived communities and women transmitted these songs, often adding their own experience. And this is the issue. This is why these songs are not historical, but a way of extracting history. That they are social experiences. So not only we have no way to tell that these poems were written exactly as we know them now. Often the people who sang them, the people who transmitted them added their own experiences. So a song, a bhajan which started out has become very different from what it was. Thus, the songs as we have them today are as much a creation of saints of generations of people who sang them. Okay? So, they may be composed by saints first, but they are as much a composition of the generations of people who have sang them after them. They are a part of our living popular culture. These days it's a practice of putting out remixes of songs that are just 5 years old. And look at the difference in the qualitative aspect. What if a bhajan was remixed again and again and again for centuries? So the point is this, okay? They are part of our popular culture. Previously, we had talked about that only few nomadic communities kept historical records. They do have rich oral traditions, especially the songs. So historians use these oral traditions to construct their history. Something very similar is here. We are using these bhajans to construct history. We are trying to understand the social message, that why this saint was writing. And now if there are so many saints that in this 14th, 15th, 16th century, they are writing or composing bhajans that have radical social message, what does it tell you? That A, it was a popular movement, B, they were unhappy with the orthodox religion, C, there were lots of inequalities and oppression in society, and people wanted to ventilate their grievances, and therefore these songs resonated with their feelings. What we should not take is the legends and myths associated with these saints. Okay. An important contribution of saints was towards the development of music. As in the case of Shankar Dev, we had seen that how he had helped in creation of new forms of drama, new forms of dance, new forms of regional script, new forms of music. Jayadev of Bengal composed the Geet Govind in Sanskrit. Each song composed in a particular rag and tal. A significant impact of these saints had on music was the use of bhajan, kirtan and abhang. Abhang was created by saints of Maharashtra Dharma. These songs, which emphasized on emotional experience, had a tremendous appeal to the common people. How much? Because even today the bhajans and the kirtans that we have in our regular religious congregations or the temples on certain ritualistic occasions, they are bhajans created by these saints. Now, the curious aspect of Geet Govind is that in this one, the relationship between Krishna and Radha is the theme of this book. Radha wasn't mentioned previously. I mean, the story of Krishna, as we know today through different TV serials, were given in Harivansh, which is kind of supplementary to Mahabharata and Bhagavad Puran. Here they talk about the birth of Krishna, how he was smuggled out of the prison cell to Vrindavan, how he was raised there, how he defeated his uncle, and other exploits of defeating different demons and different kings. They are conveyed in these things. Krishna is mentioned even before these things. Often it is believed that the Krishna Bhakti is a combination of actually different regional cults. And then stories which we know today were given in Harivansh and Bhagavad Puran. But Radha is first time, especially the relationship between Krishna and Radha is first time given in Geet Govind, which was written in 12th century. It's a medieval period composition. These were in ancient period, especially around the Gupta period, but they don't have mention of Radha. Now we are going to give a closer look to Kabir as well as Guru Nanak. Now look at the message of Kabir. O Allah, Ram present in all human beings, have mercy on your servants. Why bump your head on the ground? Criticism. Why bathe your body in water? Criticism. You kill and call yourself humble, highlighting the hypocrisy. But your vices you conceal. 24 times the Brahmin keeps Ekadashi fast, while the Qazi observes the Ramzan. Tell me, why does he set aside the 11 months? Okay. So, highlighting the contradictions in their behavior. To seek spiritual fruit in the 12th. Hari dwells in the east, they say, and Allah resides in the west. Search for him in your heart, in the heart of your heart. There he dwells, Rahim Ram. Now, if you recall the Vachan of Basavan, here he said that, what he said here? Since I don't want to, misquote, I thought it would be better if you look at it exactly. He says, listen, O Lord of 11 rivers, things standing shall fall, but the moving ever shall stay. That means the feelings of the hearts, they will stay. Similarly, even Rumi is saying that look into your heart. Okay. And now Kabir, he also says that the God dwells in heart, whichever name you call him, Ram, Rahim. So the word Ram, Rahim, okay, such composite words were created by Kabir. A 15th, 16th century figure, Kabir was one of the most influential saints. He was raised in a family of Muslim Julahas settled in or near Banaras. we have very little reliable information about his life, because he did not write his own biography. Nobody that he knew personally wrote about him. But his bhajans, his bijaks are, again transmitted orally from generation to generation, composed in popular regional language. So even those bhajans have undergone changes. The stories about his life are legendary. For example, what I just mentioned, that the quarrel between his followers had of how to dispose his dead body, and then they realized that his dead body has converted into flowers. So these are stories, and we do not know definitively about the events of his life. See, figures like Babur, Akbar, or other kings, they have their biography, Babur Nama, Akbar Nama, and stuff. But there is no Kabir Nama. So this is the problem. We get to know of his ideas from a vast collection of verses called Sakhis and Pad, said to have been composed by him and again sung by wandering bhajan singers. So they will undergo remixing, and perhaps what we have today. Often historians say that the rich body of the bijaks or the other compositions or the works attributed to Kabir were possibly composed by more than one figures and a large number of figures. In fact, each generation of composers composed some new, and they said that it was also composed by Kabir. Some of these were later collected and preserved in Guru Granth Sahib, Panchwani and Bijak. This is the collection of his works. And there is this another Kabir Granthavali also. Kabir expressed a complete rejection of major traditions, ridiculing all forms of external worship. As we saw in the poem, he is critical of, very strongly critical of popular practices. Kabir believed in a formless supreme God, and that the only path to salvation was through bhakti or devotion. Kabir drew his followers from among both Hindus and Muslims. The language of his poetry was a form of spoken Hindi understood by ordinary people widely. Again, it was understood by ordinary people widely. So it was a popular thing. Unlike the Puranas that were written in Sanskrit, the Bhakti saints of medieval period composed in regional language. If you recall, while we were discussing the first chapter, the region, and there we had this topic called regions and empires. So we say that the regional identities had, where the regional entities had coalesced up to this point. That means they have a proper identity. They have proper local languages. He also sometimes used cryptic language, which is difficult to follow. So you have this, a double meaning word where up means down and down means up. So you try to decipher the meaning by, sometimes the same word has two meanings. So in such manner. Then Guru Nanak. We know about the life of Nanak more than we know about Kabir. We know that where he was born, where he died, and that before settling in Kartarpur, he travelled widely. Some people say that he went as far as Sri Lanka. A regular worship that consisted of his singing. A regular worship that consisted of singing of his own hymns was established there for his followers. Irrespective of their former creed, caste or gender, his followers ate together in langar, despite their caste, creed and gender. So see, here also a message for social reform, of social equality. The sacred space thus created by Baba Nanak, which eventually turned into Gurudwaras. Nanak appointed Lehna Aka, I have used word AKA here. What it means? Also known as. Okay, so this is a short form of writing, also known as. This is not a word, it's a short form for also known as his successor. He compiled the compositions of Nanak and added his own into a new script. The works of three successors of Angad were compiled by Arjun Dev, and the writings of other figures like Baba Farid, we talked about Sheikh Farid here, he is from Chishti order, Sant Kabir, Bhagwat, Bhagat Namdev of Maharashtra Dharma, and Guru Tegh Bahadur were later added to the compilation. In 1706, this compilation was authenticated by Guru Gobind Singh. It is now known as Guru Granth Sahib. The number of Nanak's successors increased through the 16th century under his successors. Okay, sorry, not the number of Nanak's followers increased through the 16th century under his successor. They belong to all castes, but traders, if you recall, Guru Nanak was from a Khatri trading class. So earlier, the trading class was more attracted to it, but eventually the agriculturists, especially the Jat peasantry, got also involved. This may have something to do with the Nanak's insistence that his followers must be householders and should adopt productive and useful occupation. He said, no, you need not, renounce the world. Okay, you can stay. In fact, you must lead a productive life. They were also expected to contribute to the general funds of community of followers. We will see later the example of masnads. By the beginning of 17th century, the town of Ramdaspur, Amritsar, had developed around the central Gurdwara called Harmandir Sahib. It was virtually self-governing, and modern historians refer to the early 16th century Sikh community as a state within the state. Ergo, challenge to the established political state. Jahangir looked down upon them as a potential threat, and he ordered execution of Guru Arjan in 1606. What actually happened, that one of Jahangir's son, Prince Khusro, had revolted. Prince Khusro, okay? He was Jahangir's son. He revolted and he went in the direction of northwest Punjab, etc. So there he met Guru Arjan Dev, and it was widely believed that Guru Arjan Dev blessed him for his success. Okay, so that Jahangir took as a challenge, that you, while I am alive, you are blessing someone to succeed against me. Sikh movement began to be politicized in 17th century, which culminated in the institution of Khalsa by Guru Gobind Singh in 1699. The community of Sikhs, now called Khalsa Panth, became a political entity. The scenario in 16th and 17th century influenced, this is an important point, the development of Sikh movement. Okay, what was happening in this point, we will see. A socio-religious movement can turn political under favorable circumstances. This we will see in the next slide, what happened exactly. Look, there were already many changes going on in the Sikhism. For example, we see the example of masnads. They were appointed at different, at different levels in different areas, and their purpose was to collect contributions from the followers of the faith. Okay. Then eventually the guruship became hereditary. Okay, Arjan Dev, whose father was Guru, and then Arjan Dev became Guru, so it became hereditary. Also, eventually, the spiritual and temporal, means political authority were combined. Both spiritual and political authority was combined. They were represented by two swords, held by the gurus. At the same time, if you recall, when we were talking about the Mughal Empire, we talked about the Jagirdari and agrarian crisis, and there we said that the exploitation of imperial machinery was very brutal. The rate of tax, this rate of land revenue was very high, and this was one of the reasons why there were so many revolts during the reign of reign of Aurangzeb. We had Jat revolt, we had Satnami revolt, you had Afghan revolt, you had Sikh revolt. Primarily, the relationship between imperial power and popular local movements was tough because of these, these exploitations. When you know that your community is being dried, you are being exploited, so there is always this tension. Often defecting Mughal officials and mansabdars rallied to the cause of gurus. The things like Jat cultivators, on the one hand they were developing into peasantry, but their exploitation was going on. Also, the new way of life, they were attracted to the equality or egalitarian message of Sikhism, so they were attracted to Sikhism. Okay, and then the mistakes by Aurangzeb, especially the execution of Guru Tegh Bahadur, and then the struggle of legendary Guru Gobind Singh. So such and many other factors came together. What we said here, that the scenario in 16th and 17th century influenced the development of Sikh movement. Okay. So from the time of Jahangir, the relationship between the Mughal authority and especially the provincial authority, more than the imperial authority, this provincial authority. The relationship with them was very bad. And as you go through the stories of how every time and again there will be some conflict on some regional issue. Eventually it became larger and larger, and then Guru Tegh Bahadur was executed, and then Guru Gobind Singh, he moved into the Shivalik hills, and there he had issues with local Rajas, and there Mughals got involved, and such stories. Nanak had emphasized that the caste, gender, etc. So we said he struggled, and then what he did here, that he created the Khalsa Panth. Okay, so you had this politico-military body now. So a socio-religious movement had turned into a politico-military institution at this point. Nanak had emphasized that the caste, gender, etc. were irrelevant for attaining liberation, and the liberation wasn't construed as a state of inert bliss, not nirvana, not moksha, but the pursuit of active life with a strong sense of social commitment. He himself used the terms like Naam, Dan, and Insan for the essence of his teaching, which actually meant right worship, welfare of others, and purity of conduct. Okay, so what you have here is not only a religious message, you have an essentially a moral message. And a strong moral message, or a society that has a strong moral code of conduct, will inevitably be angry when they see injustice. And the injustice by imperial and provincial authority in the name of excessive taxation, interfering in your cultural and religious practices, and perhaps sometimes more than the high land revenue rates and the economic exploitation. It is the interference in religious and other customs that are problematic. So Nanak's idea of equality had social and political implications. Therefore, they had the readiness to fight injustice, okay, either by provincial authority or imperial authority. This might partly explain the difference between the history of the followers of Guru Nanak and the followers of other figures of medieval century like Kabir, Ravidas, and Dadu, whose ideas were very similar, but they lacked political component. See, if the message of Nanak is of equality, then if all people are equal, then one group of people should not be able to exploit another. If they are doing, then they are doing injustice. So that injustice motivates people to revolt, and when such fertile ground exists, a socio-religious movement turns into a political movement. And in fact, not only here, earlier we had talked about Dhadkari sect by Ram Das Samarth, who was a guru of Shivaji. They combined religious with political issues, and there also you eventually see that there was a rejuvenation of Marathas. So with this, our chapter on Bhakti movement concludes. Okay, we will see the next chapter in the next lecture. Thank you.